The first photograph of me was as an infant in my father's arms. We were in the dining room of the house I grew up in. I can tell by the garish wallpaper that was 1950s style. My father is looking at me, and he's holding me, and he's wearing a surgical mask. My father was clearly 70 years before his time. I'm sure there was no COVID-51 back in those days. He probably just had the sniffles. But to me, that picture of him in a mask has always been a sign of his abundant care for me, his love for me, his enthusiasm. He was always a guy who was all in, his devotion and pride in me and the family. I got into my father's arms in the not normal route. I was adopted. That wonderful scriptural metaphor for that intimate relationship with God that we all enjoy. We'll hear about again on Sunday as adopted, beloved children of God. But that metaphor for me is life. I know it, I live it. To be taken in, to be really accepted with all the rights and privileges and responsibilities of a full member of the family, being adopted, being accepted, is really the core spiritual realization of my life. It has its challenges, but I am just always been aware of how graced, how blessed, how lucky, how fortunate, what a blessing it was to have amazing parents that wanted me and to have a generous and courageous birth mother who wanted me to be wanted. It might be a bit of a stretch of Pope Francis's image of the accepting father, but I always have thought of Joseph and of my own father, like Joseph, as being an adopting father. As Francis says, accepting Mary and Jesus into his home, into his plan. The letter says this: often in life, things happen whose meanings we do not understand. Our first reaction is frequently one of disappointment and rebellion. Joseph set aside his own ideas in order to accept the course of events and, mysterious as they seemed, to embrace them, to take responsibility for them and make them part of his own history. If you were to meet my parents, they were quite a sight. My mother was a stately 6 foot tall, and my dad was around 5'9". The Simpsons stood out as a couple. Not Homer and Marge, but they stuck out anyway. My dad and mom were friends first. They met at work. He used to hang out on her front porch in Oak Park, and they would talk and then go off and do whatever they were going to do. My mother was Irish Catholic. My father was not Catholic. I didn't learn really until later in life, in fact, right before ordination, that, in fact, my father was married briefly before to a Catholic, not in the church, and divorced. And one of the great characteristics of him was that he went, without telling anyone, to the parish priest to check out if it was okay to even begin to think about dating my mother seriously. He did not want to mess that up. I don't think either of them expected imagined what life would be for them. But in another way, I think of my father actually really, it did accomplish what was in his imagination. He had an expression, actually it was more of a mandate. He would say often, as a family. That meant we were going to do something as a family. This activity, going to the zoo, going to dinner, would be done as a family. You can imagine that as a teenager, I hated that because, as teenagers, you want to be, just hatched, not have family. But I think about that, and I reflected more on it through my life. And my father really never had a family life growing up. His parents were divorced. He had really no contact with his birth father. His stepfather never adopted him. He had a stormy relationship with his mother. And again, from the letter, unless we are reconciled with our history, we will be unable to take a single step forward, for we will always remain hostage to our expectations and the disappointments that follow. My dad was a vaguely Protestant, I guess. I always used to say family was his actual religion. But his family was going to church without him, so he decided to come along. So every Sunday, as a family, we would be at the 11:15 Mass in the 9th row on the St. Joseph Side at St. Paul of the Cross Church. As I grew up in Catholic grammar school, he helped me memorize my prayers and catechism questions. And then after some health concerns, he decided to become a convert, as we used to say. Before the RCIA, you went for instruction, private meetings with the priest. So we met with Father Moriarty in secret. He didn't tell us. Until one evening, he says, we're going to go for a ride as a family. And we arrived at St. Paul of the Cross Church, and he was baptized. And that next Sunday, got in line for First Communion. Like I say, it was different in those days. And then later that year, we were confirmed on the same night. They put the adults in the back of the line of the kids. The next photo of me is of my dad and I, and I'm probably about 4 years old. And I'm wearing a t-shirt that says, Michigan 19, ? My father proudly went to the University of Michigan, and he had plans that I would do the same. I went to Loyola, and in the middle of college, decided to spend a summer in Philadelphia working at a psych hospital. I packed most of my worldly goods in my car and drove east. My father bravely waved goodbye, and I found out from my mother later that he went from there to the backyard, sat at the picnic bench, and cried. It was a turning point for his son. The next photo of my father and I is on ordination day. I'm in my new black suit and my new collar, and he is in a bright red checkered sport coat. He was always a snappy dresser. Proud and smiling, the two of us. You can see my long hair in the pictures over in whatever we call that building now. And the last picture of me and my father is the two of us with a birthday cake in front of us. It has a big 83 on it. His 83rd birthday, he was in a nursing home. He had had a stroke. He couldn't talk. His face was contorted from Parkinson's disease. But the two of us are face to face, practically nose to nose in this picture, and smiling. One of the big themes in this part 4 of this wonderful letter on Joseph is reconciliation. And we know that reconciliation means to be face to face, nose to nose, actually perhaps eyelash to eyelash. To be reconciled with our histories, our reality, our responsibilities, personal, interpersonal, societal, all of it. Pope Francis tells us that it's about reconciliation, about accepting the mystery of God working in our lives, God's hand, God's dream, God's imagination for us. And as we reflect on the accepting Father in this context, in the seminary, it strikes me that discernment is really reconciliation, about coming eye to eye with the arch of our lives that's pointed in a direction, but ultimately is a mystery. And perhaps your imagination of priesthood, of spiritual fatherhood, of what the family you long for will be like, how you will serve with a father's heart. Pope Francis reminds us when we do that, demands that we expect the unexpected. Expect the unexpected circumstances, to watch and be aware of the great mysteries that are unfolding, and to accept all people. To reconcile, in some sense, our expectations of others, of ourselves, of the church, of God, because our expectations at times, believe me, will go unmet. But it's in fact the place of disappointment that we know we really live from, right? I know in my own life, in priesthood, in pastorally parish life, the communion, the communio, the family that we hope for and pray for and preach about, when that doesn't happen, that's my deepest disappointment. But Pope Francis again gives us some advice. He says, first of all, it's not about explaining, but accepting. And that's a really big one for us who spend so much time studying so we'll have the answers, so we can be mansplainers. That first and foremost, when we meet someone, it's not about my definition of what they're supposed to be, their identity, my imagination of who they are. But first of all, what is theirs? To accept them first. Francis reminds us too, though, that this receptivity is not a passivity, but must be courageously and firmly proactive. That we do go out and reach out to accept. And that he tells us also that it's not with mere resignation, but with hope, with courage, with deeper meaning. That takes a patience and a positivity, an intentional positivity, a hope in the resurrection, in all things that are new, and being grateful, always grateful. The money line in this section of the letter for me is this: Jesus appears in our midst as a gift from the Father, which makes it possible for each of us to be reconciled to the flesh of our own history. Reconciled to the flesh of our own history. So beautiful. Even when we fail to understand it completely. The first picture of me and my accepting dad, he's in a mask. Masks these days are controversial, political, they're inconvenient. Some people argue for the right not to have to wear them. And now that we're getting vaccinated, what's the proper thing? But for me, from the beginning, these masks have been, for me, inconvenient and bold and simple act of solidarity and as a sign of abundant care for others, especially strangers. I think the letter calls us to that. So it might be a little too much to have an image of St. Joseph's statue with a mask on. That might be a little much. But I invite you, in reflecting on the accepting Father, I invite you to imagine your own scene, the very first picture of you, adopted son or daughter, in the arms of an accepting Father. And maybe he's got a mask on, just to let you know just how much he loves you.